Today's video looks a little bit different. I'm shooting right now on the Sony VX2100. This camera came out in 2003 and we will compare it to the GH5, which came out in 2017. So we have a history of 14 years between the two cameras, and I just wanted to have a fun look at how far we came in terms of video quality. So I will now roll a little test clip that I shot both on the GH5 with the Panasonic 14140 and the Sony VX2100. Have fun! As you can see, the video quality is quite different. The HD video quality of the Panasonic GH5 is a lot sharper, and also the dynamic range of the GH5 is far greater. But I have to give it to the Sony. It was a very capable camera when it came out. I have very fond memories of this camera and especially of its predecessor, the VX2000, that came out in 2000 because I shot the first jobs with this camera and also my first feature film. It was a very cringy horror movie, but maybe we can cringe at it sometime together. I only lent this camera for a couple of days to digitize the old family movies I shot on mini DV. And when I held this camera in hand, I already had a flashback of how I used my Sony VX2000 back in the day. And I remembered how much I enjoyed using this camera. It really feels nice in the hand. It has all the buttons and switches you need. The built-in lens is not that bad. I think it has great specs, and also I really like the ergonomics. I love the many buttons and switches this camera has. It's all built in. Only thing I think is missing is the XLR, but many manufacturers back in the day made a professional version of a camcorder and a prosumer version, and the Sony VX line was the prosumer version and the Sony PD line was the pro version with the XLR inputs. The Sony VX2100 has 3 Ccd sensors, but they are only 1/3 inch big. That's really tiny. Remember, the GH5, which is a crop sensor camera, only has micro four thirds, which means 4/3 of an inch. So the sensor size of the VX2100 is only quarter the size of the GH5. So you can already tell in comparison to the video I did last week when I had the same setup that the depth of field is much bigger. So I didn't expect to get the most out of focus backgrounds I ever did. But there is a neat hack I also used when shooting back in the day, and that was using long focal length. Since when you zoom in on a subject, the separation from the background is much easier, even though when you have a smaller sensor and a lower f-stop like you have with the Sony VX2100 and its 1/3 inch sized sensors. What I also want to take a look at is the low light capabilities from the GH5 in comparison to the Sony VX2100, since back in the day this camera was the undisputed low light king. Everybody was calling it the queen of the night. So I did a little low light comparison from the GH5 to the Sony VX2100, and since I didn't get the right equivalent, since the Panasonic is an f4 and the Sony is an f1.8, I just did this very unscientific test, and I was very surprised by the low light capabilities of the Sony VX2100. It's not that bad in low light. I mean, it has very heavy grain, but it wasn't that obvious since it was only SD video. The GH5 on the other hand is very grainy, but you can see the grain much more since it has a higher resolution. I think there are much better cameras out there today that give very good low light performance, like the Sony A7 series, which came from the same manufacturer like this camera. But in retrospect, I remember using this camera and I was really astonished by its low light capabilities, since it was the only camera capable of producing such lovely low light images back in the day. So this was just a little short comparison. I don't think it tells us anything new, but I thought it would be nice to see how far we came in the last years. The Sony VX2100 is a very versatile camera. It has a built-in lens with an f-stop of 1.8 at the wide end. The wide angle is moderate, but you can zoom in pretty easily, and it has a nice focus rocker. And you also have built-in NDs, which is very useful. I miss it very much on my GH5. I love the built-in NDs on my Sony FS700, but this camera was very big and very heavy and not that flexible to use when shooting weddings, for example. This camera is rather large in comparison to the GH5, but it's not that heavy. I think it has to be that big since it uses mini DV cassettes, and that takes up a lot of space. If you want, you could say that the Sony VX2100 has a recording limit. It's limited by the cassettes, which only last about 60 minutes. I think there were also cassettes with 90 minutes, but I'm not sure about that. When we compare the handling of the Sony with the GH5, it's really night and day. They are completely different. I can't really compare them. It's like apples and oranges. You have a nice focus rocker on the Sony VX2100 and you have so many controls. But the GH5 is a nice, neat little package where you can change pretty much any setting with just one hand. And that is really useful. What I miss from the GH5 is the zoom. I think it's very versatile to have that kind of zoom, but it also limits your flexibility. I think the GH5 is much more flexible when it comes to lenses. If I want, I can use the super zoom and use it like the Sony VX2100, but I can also put on the Metabone speed booster and some nice full frame lenses, so there's also that. When it comes to image quality, the GH5 blows the VX2100 out of the water. I mean, the resolution is night and day. The GH5 is one of the best HD cameras, and also the 4K is great. The Sony is limited to SD resolution, which means 720 by 576, and that's not really sharp in comparison. When we look back, when this camera came out, HD was already knocking on the door. George Lucas already shot Star Wars Episode 2 with HD cameras, and the Canon XL-H1 came out in 2005. So it's really one of the last of its kind. And it shows how far we have come in terms of technology. Not only is the resolution much greater on HD and 4K cameras, the SD cards are much more reliable than mini DV. Also, the stabilization, even though I think the Sony VX2100 does a great job, is much better in modern cameras with IBIS. And the dynamic range on modern sensors is just much better. When I used this camera, I got this nice nostalgic feel of using an old handheld camcorder, and I really appreciated the handling of it, and it got me thinking, maybe there is a place for a camera like this. If a manufacturer would make the greatest camera in this form factor, I don't think many of us would switch, since we all are very used to using mirrorless cameras. So I think it would be great to have a camcorder with this form factor, with the specs of a GH5 or even a S1, but I don't see that happen in the near future, since I think it's a generational divide. The older users are used to use camcorder bodies, and some of them don't want to switch to more modern mirrorless designs, and the DPs that started 10 years ago are already used to mirrorless body designs. So in conclusion, it was a fun little experiment. I think we came a very long way, over the last 14 years, and I'm thrilled to see what the future will show us in terms of camera technology. So I hope this comparison was fun for you. Thanks for watching. Maybe you consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video. And I hope you have a nice day and create something extraordinary.